Welcome to Lex Novus, a podcast which explores the dynamic interplay of technology, law, and policy shaping our world today from the unique perspective of Malaysia. I'm your host, Darwin Seguin, and this episode is part 2 of Artificial Intelligence in Elections and Political Campaigning. In the last episode, we looked into some of the issues arising from the use of AI in elections and political campaigning, drawing from experiences and examples in different jurisdictions around the world. We touched on the primary concern of misinformation and disinformation through AI-based campaigning, and closely linked to that, the ever-growing concern of authenticity, typified by deepfakes. We also explored the impact of bots, particularly in the space of social media, and their crippling impact on democracy. Later on in that episode, we looked at profiling of the electorate through the use of personal data, the phenomenon of nudging, and the largely unregulated industry of data brokering. Today's episode will focus on some of the laws that may affect these issues or, while intended to govern these spaces, may be inadequate. For listeners that prefer reference to the text of legislation, I would suggest viewing this podcast on YouTube, where the video will flash relevant text as we go along. Let's dive in. Looking first at misinformation and disinformation, we can see quite quickly that there are a number of laws which may be applicable depending on the circumstances. Shortly before the repeal of the Anti-Fake News Act in 2020, many claimed that the government already had sufficient laws to prevent the spread of false information. Unfortunately, it was quite clear that none of these provisions envisaged the use of artificial intelligence in dissemination of false information. The result, therefore, is that we end up attempting to tighten screws with a fork. Ingenious and resourceful, but certainly lacking in precision. Often referenced with the sections of 505 sub B of the Penal Code and section 233 sub 1 of the Communications and Multimedia Act 1998. Section 505 sub B of the Penal Code deals with statements relating to public mischief. It has a high threshold as the false statement must be made with intent and must be likely to cause fear or alarm to the public or is against public tranquility. In the context of elections and campaigning, 505 sub B may not be applicable to disinformation targeted at a specific individual or parties, where the elements of fear, alarm, and public tranquility can be challenged. Instead, the victim of such misinformation may have to consider the existing laws of defamation, both civil and criminal, for a remedy. Considering that Section 505 sub B applies to statements, rumours, or reports, it may be limited in its applicability if the disinformation is by way of imagery or video. Also of note, 505 sub B will not apply to misinformation at all, as intent is a mandatory requirement. Turning to section 233 sub 1 of the Communications and Multimedia Act, the section creates an offence by a person who, by means of any network facilities or network service or application service, knowingly makes, creates, or solicits and initiates the transmission of any comment, request, suggestion, or other communication, which is, amongst others, false. It also includes the element of intent, specifically to annoy, abuse, threaten, or harass another person. This section has been used to prosecute a few cases where false information was created and published, typically on Facebook. It is notable that while typically enforced at the lower end, the fine under this section goes up to 50,000 ringgit and the imprisonment term to 1 year. However, section 233 sub 1 is limited in that it applies to the creator of the false communication and not a disseminator. In addition to these two pieces of legislation, prosecution for dissemination of fake news can be taken under the Printing Presses and Publications Act 1984. Section 8A of the Act specifically deals with fake news. I quote, where in any publication that is maliciously published any false news, the printer, publisher, editor, and the writer thereof shall be guilty of an offence, and shall, on conviction, be liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years, or to a fine not exceeding 20,000 ringgit, or to both. While having a wider implication than just elections and campaigning, the question of whether Malaysia needs a dedicated Anti-Fake News Act is intertwined with the constitutional right of freedom of speech guaranteed under Article 10 sub 2 of the Federal Constitution, and issues of unfair political oppression. This was precisely the issue that was raised where the Anti-Fake News Act was implemented in 2018. Many felt that the then Barisan Nasional government, led by Najib Tun Razak, would use the act to prevent opposition to the authority. When a change in government took place, the act was ultimately repealed, but not without incident, as members of that same previous government managed to block its initial attempt in Parliament. In spite of its repeal, Malaysia is still experimenting with criminalisation of fake news publications. The Emergency Ordinance of 2021, introduced during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, seems to echo the wide powers of prosecution under the repealed Anti-Fake News Act, however limited to fake news relating to the pandemic and the emergency itself. While assurances have been given that this ordinance is of a wholly different nature, politicians and journalists are observing the situation with concern. Malaysia is not alone when it comes to concerns surrounding fake news legislation. Many countries around Southeast Asia have either standalone legislation or scattered provisions criminalizing publications amounting to fake news. These forms of hard law only grew with use over the pandemic period, and there are numerous reports and publications that highlight the risk to fundamental liberties associated with such laws. If Malaysia were to consider revisiting a dedicated piece of legislation, it may want to observe the impact of Singapore's controversial Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, or POFMA. POFMA, which has been around for the last 4 years, deals with a broad range of issues relating to fake news, and even contains sanctions against the use of bots to disseminate false information. The Singapore government has repeatedly defended its use, highlighting that directions under the Act do not require removal of the statement and are not sanctions. Instead, a corrections direction similar to what is found on Twitter is required to be issued, where the statement maker puts up a notice stating what the falsehood is. The public may then compare both accounts and make up their own minds. Also, POFMA applies only to false statements of fact that affect public interest. It does not apply to opinions and cannot be used just because the government disagrees with the statement. Still, a look beneath the surface shows numerous concerns, many of which are highlighted in a 2021 briefing paper by the International Commission of Jurists. The link to this paper is provided in the podcast description. Considering Malaysia's political history, we may be slow to introduce dedicated hard legislation to tackle misinformation and disinformation. But this does not mean that action cannot be taken. Based on Section 263 of the Communications and Multimedia Act, the Commission themselves have the power to take down content falling into the category of fake news. During the last general elections, the Multimedia Commission had confirmed that its Rapid Response Troop, formed in 2020, was monitoring online portals and countering fake news that could cause public distress. In this vein, we may wish to adopt a more ground zero approach that focuses on education and counter news, while exploring provisions for prosecution in limited and narrow circumstances. On that note, while consumers of information may mature or be educated in identifying false information, technology is often 2 steps ahead. No amount of guidance can cater for an inability to trust your eyes and ears, as is the case with deepfakes. For this reason, jurisdictions in the US such as Minnesota, Texas, California, and Virginia are passing deepfake-specific laws that criminalize the use of deepfakes specifically in the context of elections. The support for these laws seemed to be considerable. For example, when the bill was passed through the Senate in Minnesota, there was only a single lawmaker who objected, and the objection was because he intended for the civil penalty to be higher than what was proposed in the bill. Moving on from false information, we look into the issue of profiling. In a number of more advanced jurisdictions, profiling is captured under the data protection laws and is often tied into automated decision-making. This means that the act of profiling in itself may not be illegal. However, if that profile is then used in a decision-making process that is automated by a machine, that decision may be called into question. Malaysia's PDPA does not directly address profiling, and if we venture to attempt using the PDPA to deal with such an issue, we face a number of hurdles. The PDPA applies to the collection and processing of personal data exclusively in the context of commercial transactions. The definitions found within the Act limit the context of personal data to the data that is directly or indirectly to a data subject who is identified or identifiable from that information. In the context of profiling, the type of data used is not necessarily observed personal data, i.e. data that is directly provided or collected about the data subject, as this presents difficulties in compliance with data protection laws. Instead, predictive models used in profiling often rely on inferred data. Inferred data is the result of personal data and other publicly obtainable data points being processed, typically through a machine learning model. The output of this data processing is inferred data, i.e. data that is not directly identifiable, but which may be used to train a system to profile an individual. Borrowing from Joan Roberts, a co-founder of Trust 360, a privacy consulting firm, using the analogy of cooking, personal data may be likened to the ingredients of a dish. The act of cooking then becomes processing, and inferred data the final cooked dish. Companies have argued that inferred data is the knowledge a company generates from its processing activities and therefore is intellectual property that is owned by the creating company. However, inferred data can also be thought of as new data that is the output of processing. The definitions under Malaysia's PDPA would have to be stretched in their interpretation to accommodate inferred data as a category of personal data. As such, the PDPA would only succeed in protecting personal data under its definition and not more. Referencing a more established data protection framework, Article 4 sub 4 of the UK's GDPR deals with profiling by defining it. Any form of automated processing of personal data consisting of the use of personal data to evaluate certain personal aspects relating to a natural person, in particular, to analyze or predict aspects concerning that natural person's performance at work, economic situation, health, personal preferences, interests, reliability, behavior, location, or movements. Article 4 sub 4 is read together with Article 22 sub 1, which states that the data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal effects concerning him or her, or similarly significantly affects him or her. Based on these articles, Article 21 of the UK GDPR then gives the right to a data subject to object to profiling, if the profiling falls within the scope of Article 4 sub 4 and 22 sub 1. In the context of political campaigning, the UK's Information Commissioner's Office hasn't explicitly stated that profiling will automatically fall under the scope of Article 22, and has instead left that open to interpretation based on the nature of profiling. Campaigners would therefore need to consider whether or not their profiling can have legal or similar effects by looking at elements such as whether the profiling process is particularly intrusive, the way the advertisement is delivered is particularly intrusive, whether the combination of the profiling of personal data and the nature of the message is highly emotive and affects the individual, and if there are any particular vulnerabilities of the individuals targeted that could significantly be affected by the message. If Article 22 is applicable, the campaigner would have a string of obligations to comply with, including carrying out a data protection impact assessment. Complementing this process is the existence of core principles of fairness and transparency found in Article 5 of the UK GDPR, which adds an extra layer of consideration in the use of data in profiling. The use of profiling in campaigning and tailored political communications is still in a state of flux in the rest of Europe. In fact, only 3 states have online-specific rules for political advertising, the rest attempting to use their existing framework to address digital issues. On the other hand, certain states such as Portugal have left little for interpretation and have explicitly stated in their political marketing guidelines in March 2019 that messages such as SMS and emails by political parties to potential voters that are tailored or targeted through profiling will be covered by Article 22 of the GDPR, as they may significantly affect citizens. While Malaysia's PDPA is currently under review for amendment, it is unlikely that the amendments would incorporate provisions specifically for profiling. In that case, such a framework may be suitable for the Elections Commission to consider, as the Election Commission has the power under Section 16 of the Elections Act 1970 to make regulations for the conduct of elections. If addressed, this would certainly be in line with the Election Commission's mission statement, which is to carry the parliamentary democratic system and to guarantee the rights of citizens to elect their representatives by managing, regulating, and conducting free and fair elections. For fence-sitters uncertain if regulation is needed at all in the space of AI in elections, you may wish to read an article titled "How AI Could Take Over Elections and Undermine Democracy," published in The Conversation in June this year. The article, authored by Arkon Fung and Lawrence Lessig, imagines a situation where an AI system, which they named Clogger, is developed to pursue just one objective: to maximize the chances of a candidate prevailing in an election by changing people's voting behavior. Clogger would pay attention to you and hundreds of millions of other voters, individually. Its language model would generate messages, text, social media and email, perhaps including images and videos tailored to you personally. Clogger would also use a technique called reinforcement learning to generate a succession of messages that become increasingly more likely to change your vote. Over the course of a campaign, Clogger's message could evolve in order to take into account your responses to the machine's prior dispatches and what it has learned about changing other voters' minds. Clogger would be able to carry on dynamic conversations with you. If Clogger were to work, a competing campaigner would certainly develop a competing platform, which in the article is termed Dodger. Ultimately, votes would boil down to the most successful machine, Clogger or Dodger. Is this the future of the democratic process? Like every democracy, Malaysia has its own set of election laws that deals with campaigns as well as offences. These laws and regulations were developed decades ago and do not consider the evolution of technology. While there is clearly a need for a revisiting of these laws may still be able to handle certain aspects of the concerns arising. For example, while not specifically aimed at misinformation or disinformation, Section 4A sub 1 of the Election Offences Act 1959 could be used to prosecute a person that spreads information with the aim of promoting feelings of ill will, discontent, or hostility, with the aim of causing a person to vote or refrain from voting. This section does not necessarily require the information to be false. Section 11 sub 1, however, does make certain false statements an offence. However, these are limited in certain respects. For example, in the context of a return of a candidate or statements of withdrawal of a candidate. On advertising, while each digital platform may have its own rules on political advertising, there are limited restrictions on advertising in the Elections Offences Act. Section 24B, which provides restriction on the campaign materials, does not at all address digital materials. Similarly, Section 11 sub 1c does provide that advertisements which refer to any election are required to have the names and addresses of its printer and publisher. It is curious how this would apply to online advertisements. However, the Act does not distinguish between online and offline advertisements. Reporting rules may also play a role in understanding the spending of candidates on digital advertising. Sections 23 and 24 provide for declaration of expenditure by the candidate, and through this it may be seen how money was spent on campaign advertising. It is notable, however, that the sample form B for this purpose as contained in the Act only sets out advertising as a broad heading without the need for distinction of mode of advertising. On the front of profiling, interestingly, under Section 9 sub 1, it creates an offence of undue influence in circumstances of directly or indirectly interfering or attempting to interfere with the free exercise by any person of any electoral right. While still untested, it could be argued, similar to the stance taken by Portugal, that unconsented digital profiling and nudging could amount to an interference with free will, thus breaching Section 9 sub 1. Considering Malaysia's present state of laws in the space of AI in elections and political campaigning, it is clear that there is a lot to consider. For example, should the concerns be addressed by amendments to the legislation? Should we consolidate the issues under an umbrella of legislation? Should we instead address the issues more expeditiously through policy or regulation? No matter the answer, the one certainty is that the rapidity of unfettered AI use in this space should be a cause for concern, as it is a direct impact on our fundamental democratic rights. For additional reading, I'd invite you to pay special attention to the following papers: Examples of Data Points Used in Profiling by Privacy International, Singapore, ICJ calls on government to repeal or substantially amend the POFMA 2 years after it has entered into force, Social Media and Online Political Campaigning in Malaysia, a paper by University Technology Mara, and the Information Commissioner's Office, Profiling in Political Campaigning. Thanks for listening and see you next time on Lex Novus.